A teenage boy sat quietly in his first-class seat, ticket in hand, saying nothing to anyone. But the flight attendant didn't care. She looked at his clothes, rolled her eyes, and accused him of stealing the seat. Within seconds, she slapped him, right in front of everyone. What she didn't realize? The man sitting 3 rows behind her wasn't just another passenger. He was the boy's father, and the owner of the entire airline. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss the next one. He was only 16, sitting quietly near the boarding gate with his caretaker, a kind and soft-spoken woman named Brenda, who had been with his family since he was a toddler. He wore simple clothes, a navy hoodie, sneakers, and jeans, and kept his head low, scrolling through his phone while waiting for the boarding call. It was his first time flying without his parents, and though he looked calm on the outside, inside he was nervous. He had always flown with his family in private jets or with his father beside him, but this time he was flying first class with just Brenda, and he wanted everything to go smoothly. The ticket had been booked under his full name, and his father had made sure every detail was in place. He even had a handwritten note in his bag from his dad, telling him to be brave and enjoy the flight. When boarding started, Brenda gently took his bag while he showed the attendant his ticket. The woman at the gate smiled, scanned their passes, and nodded them through. They walked down the jet bridge, and soon they were stepping into the cool, luxurious space of the first-class cabin. Wide seats, soft lighting, and quiet music playing. It felt like a different world. The boy, whose name was Elliot, sat near the window while Brenda placed their bags in the overhead bin. He fastened his seatbelt and pulled out his headphones, excited to watch a movie and relax. But then she appeared. A flight attendant named Cheryl, with sharp cheekbones, red lipstick, and a tight expression, stopped beside their row. She didn't smile. She didn't greet them like she had with the other passengers. Her eyes moved straight to Elliot, narrowing slightly. She looked him up and down, then glanced at Brenda with a raised brow. "Is this your seat?" she asked flatly. Brenda nodded and held out the tickets again. "Yes, ma'am. We're in 1A and 1B. Cheryl barely looked at the tickets before folding her arms. "This section is for first-class passengers only." The words came out cold and clear. Brenda blinked. "Yes, we know. This is first class. These are our seats." Elliot didn't say anything. He could already feel the tension growing. People nearby had turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Cheryl's face didn't soften. "You'll need to return to your correct seats. If these were printed wrong, we'll sort it out, but you can't stay here." Brenda frowned. "These aren't wrong. His father booked these seats. Everything was confirmed." She pulled out her phone to show the booking email, but Cheryl waved her hand in irritation. "That's not necessary. You can take your things and move to the back. I don't have time for this." Her voice grew sharper, her tone disrespectful. Elliot looked up, confused and embarrassed. "But this is my seat," he said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Cheryl's eyes narrowed further. "Are you talking back to me?" And before anyone could say a word, she slapped him. Her hand moved fast, striking his cheek with a loud snap that echoed through the cabin. Everything stopped. A few people gasped. A businessman lowered his coffee. A woman covered her mouth. Brenda stood frozen, one hand still holding her phone. Elliot sat completely still, stunned. His cheek turned red, and his eyes blinked slowly, trying to understand what just happened. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just stared at Cheryl, stunned and silent. Cheryl glared down at him, her voice tight. "Don't raise your voice again, not on this plane." The silence in the cabin was heavy. No one moved. Cheryl turned and walked away like it was nothing. Elliot slowly reached into his pocket, unlocked his phone, and typed a short message. "She hit me, first class." Then he pressed send. Brenda was still frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Elliot, then down the aisle where Cheryl had disappeared. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a napkin and gently pressed it to Elliot's cheek. "Are you okay, baby?" she whispered. Elliot nodded slightly, but he didn't speak. His fingers curled around his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. Brenda stood up, her voice low but firm now. "I need to speak to the captain, now." A few nearby passengers began murmuring, some clearly disturbed by what they had just seen. One man leaned over to his wife and whispered, "Did she really just hit him?" The wife gave a small nod, her eyes still fixed on Elliot. But no one stood up, no one raised their voice. They all just watched. Elliot's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen. It was a reply from his father. "What do you mean she hit you? Where are you?" Elliot typed back quickly, his hands shaking slightly. "Still in seat 1A. She said I didn't belong here." Brenda tried to explain. "She slapped me in front of everyone." Another buzz came seconds later. "Sit tight, do not move, I'm on this flight." Elliot blinked. He read the message again. His father was on the flight? He looked up, scanning the cabin. Brenda sat down beside him again, her jaw clenched. "I'm going to report her the second we land," she muttered. "This isn't going to be forgotten." But Elliot barely heard her. He looked toward the back of the cabin. A man had just stood up from one of the last rows in first class. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit, and moved with quiet authority. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something cold and steady. It was his father, Preston, and he had heard everything. Without a word, Preston walked slowly toward the front. Heads turned. The cabin went quiet again. Brenda gasped when she saw him. Elliot sat up straighter. Cheryl, who was halfway down the aisle offering drinks to another passenger, turned and froze when she saw him coming. Her fake smile faded instantly. Preston stopped beside her. His voice was calm but carried a sharp edge. "You slapped my son." Cheryl's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She blinked, clearly trying to process what she had just heard. I didn't realize," he cut her off. "You didn't realize he was my son? Or you didn't realize what you were doing when you put your hand on him?" Passengers leaned in slightly, sensing something serious unfolding. Cheryl's face flushed red. "I thought he wasn't supposed to be in that seat. I thought he was trying to sneak in." Preston took one step closer. "You thought. That's the problem." His voice was still quiet, but now it carried weight. "Did you check his ticket?" I asked to see it, but it didn't seem right." "Did you call anyone to confirm?" "No, I didn't think I needed to." "And instead you chose to put your hands on him in front of a full cabin?" Preston's voice never rose, but Cheryl flinched like he had shouted. "You didn't think he belonged in first class, so you made a decision. That decision will now cost you everything." Cheryl looked around, realizing every eye was on her. Whispers moved through the rows. Phones were recording. Her confidence drained. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Preston turned away from her, looked toward the flight crew area, and motioned to one of the junior attendants. "Get the captain on the phone. Tell him Preston Carter needs to speak with him, now." The junior attendant moved fast. Cheryl stood frozen, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her. The authority she had carried just minutes ago had vanished. "And Elliot?" He sat quietly in his seat, watching his father take control of the sky. The cabin was so quiet now that even the sound of the engine felt distant. Cheryl stood stiffly beside the drink cart, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to keep her breathing steady. Preston didn't look at her again. He stood near Elliot's seat, his back straight, eyes focused ahead. The junior flight attendant returned quickly, holding a small phone unit from the crew intercom. She handed it to Preston without a word. Preston pressed the receiver to his ear. "Captain, this is Preston Carter. I assume you've been notified." A brief pause, then, "Good. I want her removed from all cabin duties immediately. She is not to speak to any passenger. And when we land, I want ground security waiting at the gate." Cheryl's face turned pale. She looked around the cabin as if hoping someone would defend her, but no one spoke. Even the passengers who had once ignored the situation were now wide-eyed, pretending to scroll through phones while watching closely. The captain's voice came through the speaker, loud enough that Preston didn't even have to repeat the words. "Understood, sir. She will be relieved of duty at once." Preston handed the phone back to the junior attendant, then turned slowly toward Cheryl. His voice was calm but final. "Go to the back. Do not speak to another passenger. Do not move unless instructed. You are finished for this flight." Cheryl opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She lowered her head and pushed the drink cart toward the rear, each step feeling heavier than the last. No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence itself was her punishment. Brenda exhaled shakily and looked at Elliot. "Are you all right?" He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know he was on the flight." She gave a soft smile. "He doesn't like to announce himself. That's how he keeps people honest." Preston sat down beside his son. His eyes softened now. "You handled that better than most adults would." Elliot looked at him, his voice small. "I didn't know what to do." Preston shook his head. "You didn't have to do anything. You did exactly what I've taught you. Stay calm. Tell the truth. Let the right people handle the wrong ones." A nearby passenger, a man in a gray sweater, leaned across the aisle. "Sir, I saw what happened. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not saying something sooner." Preston glanced at him, nodded once, and replied, "Thank you, but you should have said it earlier." The man looked down, ashamed. The flight attendant named Cheryl was now seated in the back row, eyes fixed on her lap. She looked like someone who had been stripped of everything she thought she controlled. Behind her, two other crew members whispered in hushed voices, clearly aware of what had unfolded. Up front, Preston adjusted his seat. Brenda quietly handed Elliot a bottle of water. No one said much after that. The atmosphere had changed. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. Power no longer lived in the uniform of the crew. It now sat quietly beside a boy with a swollen cheek and a calm expression. Elliot reached into his backpack and pulled out the letter his father had written him before the flight. He unfolded it and read the last line again, now with a new meaning. "You are stronger than they think. Never forget who you are." The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, but the tension in the cabin didn't fade. Every now and then, passengers would glance toward the front, their eyes flicking from Elliot to Preston, then quickly away as if ashamed to be caught staring. Brenda had pulled a blanket over Elliot's legs, whispering gently to him now and then, while Preston sat beside them, calm and unreadable. Back in the crew galley, Cheryl sat with her arms folded, her gaze locked on the floor. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her thoughts racing. She had handled hundreds of flights. She had turned away people before, questioned travelers she didn't trust, and not once had she been challenged. Until today. She hadn't known who he was. She hadn't even thought to ask. She just looked at him, at his clothes, at his face, and decided. Now, her decision had reached the cockpit, and far beyond. Near her, a younger flight attendant named Grace leaned against the counter, stealing quiet glances at her. Grace had watched the whole thing unfold, and though she hadn't spoken out during the incident, her silence had started to feel like guilt. After a long pause, she finally said, "You really didn't check his name?" Cheryl didn't answer. Grace looked down, choosing her words carefully. "You didn't question the man in 3C who came in wearing cargo shorts and sandals, but you questioned a boy who showed you his ticket." "I thought he was lying," Cheryl snapped, her voice low and shaky. "I didn't think he belonged in that seat." Grace nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. "You didn't think, that's the problem." Cheryl didn't reply. Her throat tightened, and she stared harder at the floor. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain ended a quiet call with ground control and turned to his co-pilot. "Security's already been notified. Mr. Carter made it clear she's not walking off this plane like nothing happened." The co-pilot gave a small nod. "They're sending 2 officers to meet us at the gate." Back in first class, Elliot leaned his head against the window, still quiet. Preston looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" Elliot shrugged. "I'm wondering if she would have hit me if I looked different." Preston was silent for a moment. Then he spoke gently. "Maybe not. But what matters now is that she won't do it again." Elliot turned to face him. How do you know? Preston didn't answer with words. He simply reached for the cabin phone again and called the flight manager on the ground. This is Preston Carter. I need full video from today's flight pulled immediately. Cabin security footage, passenger statements. I want everything reviewed before we land. The voice on the other end confirmed. Then Preston hung up and looked at his son with steady eyes. Because we're not just going to hold her responsible. We're going to make sure the whole system learns from this. Elliot gave a small nod. He didn't feel powerful. Not yet. But something had shifted. The silence that had once felt heavy now felt like something else. Respect. And at the back of the plane, Cheryl slowly began to realize this wasn't going away. The minutes ticked by, but for Cheryl, time felt stuck. Every second stretched longer than the last. She had stopped pretending to look busy. Her hands rested stiffly on her lap, and her mouth was dry. From the corner of her eye, she noticed one of the other attendants whispering something into the cabin phone. She didn't have to ask what it was about. She already knew. She looked around and saw passengers passing glances her way when she moved through the aisle earlier. They weren't just looking anymore. They were watching, judging, remembering. And the worst part? They had all seen what she had done before they knew who the boy was. She couldn't hide from it now. At the front of the plane, Preston sat calmly, but his mind was moving. He had built his airline from nothing. People often saw the suits, the private offices, the media headlines. But they didn't see the long nights, the cold boardrooms, the fights to be taken seriously in a world that didn't expect someone like him to be in charge. That's why this moment wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It was about all the young kids like his son who might not have a father in seat 4A ready to stand up. He glanced at Elliot, who had fallen into a quiet stillness. Not asleep, but resting. His cheek was still faintly red. Brenda reached into her bag and handed Preston a small envelope. "You told me to carry this just in case," she said softly. Figured now might be the time. Preston took it, opened the flap, and slid out a folded letter. Official airline documents. Inside were 2 cards. One was Elliot's first-class membership, marked with a private signature known only to senior crew. The other was a platinum ID badge issued to airline family members. His son had been fully cleared officially and personally, and Cheryl had still decided he didn't belong. Preston tucked the envelope into his jacket. He looked over his shoulder. The passengers were quiet now, but alert. He stood again, slowly, and walked toward the middle of the cabin where the remaining attendants were quietly finishing service. He didn't raise his voice. "I'd like to speak with the rest of the crew, please, away from the passengers." One by one, the attendants followed him into the small galley. Cheryl remained seated until one of them tapped her lightly on the shoulder. She didn't want to move, but she knew refusing would only make things worse. Once the crew was gathered, Preston spoke clearly. "You've all been trained to treat passengers with dignity. Not just the ones you think are important. Not just the ones who match what you expect. Today, that training failed, and you stood by and let it happen." Some of the crew shifted uncomfortably. Cheryl looked down. "I'm not here to scare you," Preston continued. "But understand this. When you work for my airline, you answer for the way you treat every soul on that plane. That boy you dismissed, that boy is mine. But even if he wasn't, he deserved better than what happened." No one spoke. "You'll each write a full report before this day ends," he added. "Because when we land, this won't stay in the air." He looked Cheryl in the eye just once before turning back down the aisle. She didn't try to follow. She didn't have the strength. Not anymore. Preston returned to his seat without another word. The moment he sat down, he looked at Elliot, who now sat upright, alert again. There was a trace of something different in the boy's eyes. Not fear, not confusion, something steadier. Preston nodded at him, as if to say, "I saw it too." Brenda leaned in and whispered, "That crew doesn't know who they're dealing with. They've never seen you like this." Preston gave the faintest smile. "They're not supposed to see me like this. That's the point, but now they will." In the row behind them, a man in a business suit quietly cleared his throat. "Sir, I just wanted to say I saw the whole thing. I'm sorry I didn't step in." Preston didn't turn around. His reply was calm but firm. "And if you hadn't known who we were, would you still feel sorry?" The man had no answer. Silence fell again. Back in the galley, Cheryl stood with her back against the wall, her heart racing. Her hands were cold, and she could feel the weight of stares from her own co-workers. Grace, the younger attendant, tried to say something but hesitated. She didn't want to add to the tension, but the air was thick with it. Finally, Cheryl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake, I get that." Grace looked at her. "This wasn't just a mistake. This was something you didn't even stop to question. You just saw him and decided. You didn't ask. You didn't confirm. You didn't care." "I thought he was trying to sneak in," Cheryl mumbled. "You thought he didn't belong." That silence again. And it hurt more than any insult could. Cheryl sank into one of the jump seats and stared at her shoes. She felt the pressure building in her chest, but she couldn't cry. Not here. Not yet. She had spent years thinking she knew how things worked. Years believing she was doing the right thing, following rules, keeping order. But this wasn't about order. This was about pride. This was about judgment. And now, she was the one being judged. In the cockpit, the captain received another message from ground operations. He read the screen carefully, then nodded to the co-pilot. "Security detail confirmed. Mr. Carter's instructions have been approved. Escort will be waiting at Gate 4 as soon as we arrive." The co-pilot glanced toward the door. "Think she knows what's coming?" The captain sighed. "She's going to find out soon enough." Meanwhile, Elliot opened the note his father had written him again. The corner of the paper was now bent from how many times he had touched it. He read the words over and over. "You don't need to shout to be heard. Strength doesn't always speak loud. Sometimes it just sits still and waits." He folded the paper and placed it back into his backpack. Across the aisle, a woman leaned in slightly and said in a gentle voice, "You were very brave." Elliot turned to her, surprised. "Thank you." The woman smiled kindly. "Most people would have screamed. You didn't. That's real power." Brenda glanced at her and nodded, grateful someone had finally said something. But Elliot didn't smile. He wasn't proud. Not yet. Because the truth was, he didn't want to be brave today. He just wanted to fly, watch a movie, land safely, and go home. But someone decided he didn't look like he belonged in seat 1A. And now, everything had changed. From the back of the plane, Cheryl slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her small crew-issued notepad. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened to a blank page and wrote, "Today, I let pride speak louder than reason." She stared at the words for a long time. She didn't know if she was writing it for herself or for someone else. But it was the first thing she'd written down that didn't feel like an excuse. The hum of the engines continued overhead, smooth and steady. But inside the cabin, the air felt tight, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was sharp. No one dared to make jokes or small talk anymore. Even the flight attendants moving through the aisles now spoke only when necessary. Their voices lowered, their hands steady but stiff. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what it revealed. Elliot sat with his head leaned against the seat, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. Preston watched him out of the corner of his eye. There was something in Elliot's posture he recognized, something he knew all too well. Not sadness, not anger, but the weight of being seen for the wrong reasons. The kind of weight that stays with you long after people apologize. Preston placed a firm hand on Elliot's shoulder. "Tell me what you're feeling," he said softly. Elliot hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned to his father. "She didn't even ask my name. She looked at me and made up her mind." Preston nodded once, his jaw clenched. "You're right." "I didn't even speak loud," Elliot added. "I was just sitting here. And she didn't even talk to the man across from us. He looked like he just woke up in a laundromat." That pulled a quiet breath from Brenda, who tried not to laugh. But her face stayed serious. She reached for Elliot's hand and held it gently. She picked me, Elliot said, voice lower now. Out of everyone. Preston let the silence sit for a moment. Then he leaned in and said, "And now everyone's watching her because you didn't scream, you didn't fight, you didn't give her what she expected. You gave her truth, and now she has to live with it." Elliot looked down, unsure of how to respond. It was comforting, yes, but it didn't erase what had already happened. It didn't wipe away the sting on his cheek or the sting of that first moment when someone's eyes said, "You don't belong here." In the rear galley, Cheryl was still holding the notepad. The words she had written stared back at her, and for the first time in years, she had no answers. Her fingers moved slowly, writing again. He was polite. He was calm. And I still chose to humiliate him. She stared at the sentence for so long her vision began to blur. The walls around her felt smaller than they ever had before. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Grace standing there, arms crossed but her expression softer now. "You know what's going to happen when we land, right?" Grace said quietly. Cheryl didn't answer. "They've already contacted the gate. Security will be waiting." Cheryl looked at her and whispered, "Do you think I deserve it?" Grace hesitated. Then she replied, "It's not about what I think. It's about what you did." Cheryl blinked quickly, trying to steady herself. "I didn't know who he was." Grace shook her head. "That's not the problem. You didn't know what he was. You didn't think he was worthy of first class. That's what's going to stay with people." Back at the front of the plane, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent in approximately 20 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Passengers began shifting in their seats, adjusting their tray tables, some pretending to settle in, others watching quietly, wondering what would happen next. Preston leaned toward Brenda. "When we land, walk Elliot straight to the private car. There'll be press waiting. I don't want him dealing with cameras or questions." Brenda nodded. "What about you?" "I'm staying." Elliot turned to him. "Why?" Preston looked at his son, his voice low but strong. "Because lessons only stick when the consequences follow. I'm not walking off this flight until everyone who needs to answer does." Elliot didn't respond, but the corners of his mouth turned slightly, half gratitude, half relief. He didn't know what his father planned to do after the landing, but he knew this. The woman who slapped him wasn't going to walk out of that airport like she had walked into the cabin, sure of herself, untouchable, proud. Not anymore. And Cheryl? Sitting at the back, she wasn't thinking about defending herself anymore. She wasn't preparing excuses. For the first time, she was thinking about what it meant to look at someone and decide who they are, without asking, without listening, without caring. And that thought hurt more than anything else. The descent had begun, but for many on board, it felt like the flight had already landed somewhere they weren't ready for. The wheels hadn't touched the ground, but the truth had already arrived. People who had watched silently during the earlier chaos now sat upright, pretending to read safety cards or browse the in-flight magazine, though their eyes kept shifting forward, toward Elliot, toward Preston, and toward the heavy silence that surrounded the front cabin. Brenda gently reached across the armrest, brushing Elliot's curls back from his forehead. "Your father's right," she whispered. "What happened today? You didn't deserve it. But you stood tall anyway." Elliot didn't answer. He kept looking straight ahead, his hands folded on his lap. He wasn't angry. He wasn't crying. But something had hardened inside him. Something small and quiet, but strong. It had taken just one slap to change how he would see people forever. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy blazer slowly leaned over. Her voice was soft, but certain. "I saw everything," she said. "And I should have said something. I'm sorry." Elliot turned toward her. His expression didn't shift much, but he gave a slight nod. "You weren't the only one," he replied. The woman's eyes dropped to her lap. Preston was silent too. He wasn't the kind of man who exploded. He didn't raise his voice in public. But when his mind turned quiet, his actions turned sharp. And right now, Every second of silence was shaping what would happen once they reached the gate. He looked out the window, watching as clouds gave way to rooftops, runways, and city lights. Below, the ground teams were already moving. He knew his assistant had followed protocol. Security would be stationed just outside the jet bridge, discreet, but ready. 2 executives from his corporate office would be standing by. One of them had already received Cheryl's name. And by now, the video had been reviewed by legal. The process had started. What came next would be swift. In the rear galley, Cheryl wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve. Her cheeks were blotchy now. She had stopped pretending to act normal. Her name badge was still clipped neatly to her uniform, but it didn't carry the weight it used to. She could hear the landing gear lowering beneath the floor, the cabin lights dimming slightly. The captain's voice came over the speaker one last time. "Crew, prepare for landing." Cheryl stood on shaky legs and walked over to the intercom. Her fingers hovered over the button but didn't press it. She didn't need to say anything anymore. Everyone knew. She turned and sat back down, facing the rear bulkhead like a schoolchild waiting outside the principal's office. Grace stood near her, arms crossed. She wasn't smiling. "You still have a chance to say something before this is over," she said. "Not for them, for yourself." Cheryl didn't answer. Back in first class, Preston reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened the Notes app and typed a single line. "Press. No statements today. Let the footage speak." Then he sent it. Brenda leaned closer to Elliot. "When that door opens, there might be a lot of flashing cameras. Just keep walking. Don't stop. Don't speak." "I don't want to be famous," Elliot muttered. "You're not," Preston said. "You're visible. There's a difference. And now they're going to have to look at what they ignored." As the wheels touched down, the plane bounced gently before settling into a smooth glide down the runway. The cabin jolted slightly as the brakes engaged, and passengers began collecting their things, though the seatbelt sign was still on. Preston didn't move. Brenda stayed still, and Elliot sat quietly, his eyes now locked on the exit ahead like it was the finish line of something bigger than a flight. The woman in the navy blazer stood and spoke again, this time louder, addressing no one in particular. "You all saw it happen. We all did." A few passengers looked up. She turned slightly, her voice firmer now. "A boy was slapped, and not a single one of us stood up." The man in the business suit nodded slowly. "That's not going to leave my mind anytime soon." Someone else muttered, "It's on camera." Everyone saw it. Elliot didn't say anything, but this time when he looked around, he saw something different. Guilt, reflection, shame, maybe even a little respect. The plane rolled to a gentle stop. The seatbelt sign dinged off. And outside the window, Elliot spotted them. 3 uniformed security officers standing at the edge of the jet bridge, one holding a clipboard, another scanning the crew manifest. Cheryl hadn't seen them yet, but she would. The cabin door clicked, and the soft mechanical whir of the jet bridge locking into place signaled the end of the flight, but not the end of the story. As the usual announcements began playing over the speaker, no one moved. There was no eager scramble for overhead luggage, no cheerful chatter. Just a strange, tense stillness as the passengers sat frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Preston remained seated, perfectly composed. His phone was back in his pocket, his legs crossed, one hand resting calmly on the armrest. He had no reason to rush. Brenda leaned toward Elliot, whispering, "Don't look back. Just focus forward when it's time to leave." Elliot nodded, his hands still clasped tightly together. His heart was racing, but not out of fear. It was something else, something heavier. He wasn't worried about getting off the plane. He was thinking about what might happen to Cheryl, and if she'd even understand why. In the back, Cheryl finally stood, smoothing the wrinkles on her skirt. She hadn't said a word since the landing. The other crew members were avoiding eye contact. Her own team now felt like strangers. The intercom buzzed in the galley, and one of the junior attendants picked it up, listened quietly, then turned toward her. "They're asking for you," she said. Cheryl froze. "Now." The attendant nodded. Now. She swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her palms clammy. She stepped out from the galley and took a few shaky steps down the aisle. As she passed through the rows of first class, the same seats she had once ruled with confidence, eyes followed her. But no one spoke. It wasn't just Preston watching her now. Everyone was. Elliot didn't turn his head, but he felt her presence as she passed. He could smell the familiar floral scent of her perfume. For a moment, the memory of the slap burned hot in his mind again. He stayed still. Cheryl reached the front of the plane and stood beside the open cabin door. Outside, 2 airport security officers and a man in a dark blazer were waiting. One holding a clipboard, the other scanning the cabin interior. The man in the blazer stepped forward, identified himself as an airline operations manager, and spoke with practiced calm. "Miss Dawson, you are being escorted off this flight per direct instruction from executive oversight. You are to remain present for a formal review and incident report. Please cooperate fully." Cheryl's voice cracked as she whispered, "Yes, sir." A murmur passed through the cabin. One of the officers stepped inside. "Miss, come with us, please." Cheryl's eyes flicked once to Preston, then quickly away. She started down the bridge, her footsteps quiet but heavy. No one followed her. No one offered comfort. She walked alone. Inside the cabin, someone stood up, an older man from row 2. He looked down at Preston and said carefully, "I just want you to know, sir, I've flown with this airline for years. I've never seen anything like this before." Preston looked up. "That's the problem." The man nodded slowly and sat back down. The line to disembark began to form, but no one rushed to be first. There was a strange kind of respect in the air now, an invisible curtain that separated Preston and Elliot from the rest of the passengers. People gave them space. They waited. The woman in the navy blazer stepped closer to them as the line moved. "I hope your son knows he did nothing wrong, and that what happened was seen, really seen." Brenda smiled gently. "He knows." Preston stood, adjusted his jacket, and held his hand out for Elliot. The boy took it, rising from his seat with quiet composure. As they stepped into the aisle, a few passengers nodded at them, not out of pity but acknowledgement. They weren't just walking off a flight. They were walking out of a moment that no one would forget. As they reached the cabin door, Preston paused and looked back, not at the passengers, but at the seat where Elliot had been sitting. Seat 1A. He stared at it for a moment. Then he turned back and stepped into the jet bridge with his son. Outside, the flashes started immediately. Photographers, reporters, microphones held high. Preston kept walking. Brenda stayed close behind them, shielding Elliot slightly from the chaos. One of the security officers cleared a path as they approached a waiting black car parked just beyond the doors. Elliot looked up at his father. "Are they all here because of what happened?" Preston nodded. "They'll tell the story either way. We just made sure they get it right." As they got into the car, Elliot glanced out the window and saw Cheryl standing beside 2 airport officials near a service entrance. Her posture was stiff, her head low, and even from a distance he could tell she looked smaller now. Not because of the cameras, not because of the punishment, but because the truth had finally caught up. The black car rolled away from the terminal, the windows tinted against the flurry of cameras and questions still echoing behind them. Inside, the silence felt different now. Not heavy like before, not filled with tension or hurt. It was quiet with intention, with understanding. Elliot stared out at the passing runway lights, still gripping his backpack like it was armor. Brenda sat on his other side, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder while Preston checked his phone. Messages already piling in, most of them from executives, board members, and legal. He skimmed a few, then locked the screen and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. "No calls," he said firmly to no one in particular. "Not until we're home." Elliot finally spoke. "What's going to happen to her?" Preston looked over, calm but serious. "That depends on her. But she's not walking away like it didn't happen. And she's not going to decide who belongs in first class ever again." Elliot nodded slowly. She looked so sure of herself when she told me to move. Like she'd done it before. She probably has, Brenda said quietly. Maybe not with her hands, but with her eyes, her tone, her assumptions. Preston looked out the front windshield, his voice steady. That's the kind of power that people use quietly. It's not in rules or laws. It's in the belief that no one will stop you. But she picked the wrong child, and the wrong father. Back at the airport, Cheryl sat alone in a cold, windowless conference room near the staff operations wing. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the only sound was the ticking of a small clock on the wall. Her uniform blazer was folded neatly on the chair beside her. Her hands were laced together tightly, knuckles white from the grip. Her heart was still racing, not because she was afraid of losing her job, but because she had finally realized how badly she had failed. Across from her, the airline's regional HR manager sat reading a printed incident report. The footage had already been reviewed. Passenger statements had been collected. Nothing was left to interpretation. Cheryl had slapped a teenage boy in front of witnesses. She had denied him his seat after verifying his ticket. And she had done all of it based on how he looked, how he dressed, and what she believed he shouldn't be. "Miss Dawson," the manager said, placing the papers down. "Before we continue, is there anything you'd like to say?" Cheryl opened her mouth, but no words came out. The manager gave her time. After a long pause, her voice finally cracked through the silence. "I didn't think he belonged. I thought he was lying." "And now?" the manager asked, not coldly but directly. Cheryl looked up, her eyes red. "Now I know it wasn't just a mistake. I treated him like a problem before I even spoke to him." The manager nodded once and made a note. "The Carter family has chosen not to pursue criminal charges," she continued. "But Mr. Carter has made it clear that a formal review will go to the board, and you are suspended until that review is complete." Cheryl nodded, ashamed but unsurprised. "Also," the manager added, sliding a printed email across the table, "Mr. Carter asked us to show you this." Cheryl hesitated before reading it. It was short. Just a message from Preston, sent directly from his phone after the flight. "She doesn't owe me an apology. She owes my son her respect. He didn't get it. Now he will." Cheryl lowered the paper slowly. Her eyes stung. The tears didn't fall yet, but they were there, quietly building at the edge. She wasn't crying for her job. She was crying because she saw herself clearly now, and she didn't like what she saw. Across the city, the black car pulled into the driveway of Preston's private residence, a large, gated property that was quiet and peaceful, far from the chaos of the airport. As they stepped inside, a housekeeper took their coats, and Brenda guided Elliot toward the stairs. But Elliot stopped halfway and turned back to his father. "Dad?" Preston looked at him. "I want to go to school like normal tomorrow. No drivers, no one walking me in. Just normal." Preston raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Elliot nodded. "Yeah. I don't want to be treated special because something bad happened. I just want people to know I belong, without having to prove it." Preston took a slow breath. Then he walked over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You never have to prove anything to anyone, but if you want normal, we'll give you normal." Elliot smiled for the first time all day. Just a little. Brenda gave him a quick hug and nudged him toward his room. As Elliot disappeared upstairs, Preston turned toward the living room and finally let himself sit down. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. It had been a long flight, and for the first time, it wasn't turbulence in the air that made it difficult. It was what happened when people forgot that power wasn't in the uniform or the seat assignment. It was in how you treat the quiet kid sitting in 1A. And now, that kid would never be overlooked again. The next morning came with a pale sky and a crisp silence outside Preston's home. But inside, the house was already moving. Brenda stood in the kitchen, quietly packing Elliot's lunch. The television was on in the background, low volume, Morning news anchors speaking in the polished tones of people trying to sound calm even when they weren't. The headline on screen read, "Airline flight attendant under fire after first-class incident involving CEO's son." Preston stood by the window, a cup of coffee in hand, watching his son lace his sneakers near the staircase. Elliot was dressed in his usual style, hoodie, backpack slung over one shoulder, headphones hanging around his neck. He looked like any other 16-year-old getting ready for school, but Preston knew that nothing about this morning was truly normal. "Your driver's waiting," Preston said gently. "I told you I want to take the bus," Elliot replied without turning around. Preston didn't argue. He nodded once. "The driver will follow, at a distance, just in case." Elliot let out a sigh, but he didn't protest again. He stood, grabbed his bag, and turned to face his father. "If anyone asks me about it today, what do I say?" Preston looked at him carefully. "You don't owe anyone your story, but if you decide to speak, tell the truth, nothing more." Elliot nodded, then walked toward the front door. Before he stepped out, Brenda stopped him and slipped a small folded note into his hoodie pocket. "Don't open that unless you need it," she said with a wink. He smiled and left, the door closing softly behind him. As the bus pulled up to the stop at the corner, Preston's phone buzzed. A call from the boardroom. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened his laptop and began reviewing internal reports. Emails had flooded in overnight. Half were from department heads offering support, and the other half from PR teams preparing statements. But Preston wasn't ready to release anything yet. He believed in statements, but only after accountability. Words meant nothing without change. Across the city, Cheryl sat in her apartment at the small kitchen table she usually never used. The blinds were closed, and the air inside was stale. Her uniform hung over a chair, untouched. The name badge that once gave her confidence now felt like a curse. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. She didn't open it. Instead, she opened the apology email she had drafted the night before. The screen glowed with the message she hadn't been able to send. Subject: "To the boy, I failed." She stared at the blinking cursor at the end of her final sentence. She had rewritten it a dozen times, but it always ended the same. "I didn't see you." And that was the problem. She moved her hand toward the mouse to press send, but froze again. What if it was too late? What if it didn't matter? What if he didn't want to hear from her? Just as she was about to close the laptop, another window popped up. A new message. It was from Grace. "They're doing bias training now. Mandatory. Starting next week. Thought you'd want to know." Cheryl didn't respond, but a part of her breathed out. Something had shifted. Something had started. And maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been erased completely. Just forced to stop and look in the mirror. Meanwhile, in a boardroom 15 floors above the city, 3 executives sat across from Preston, who had finally joined the video call. One of them, a tall woman with glasses, began reading from a prepared statement. "We've reviewed the footage, gathered passenger testimonies, and confirmed that the actions taken by the flight attendant violated protocol at every level." Preston listened without expression. "She's been suspended indefinitely, pending a final hearing. The union is asking for a chance at reinstatement, but we're leaving that decision in your hands." He leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "This isn't about her anymore. It's about the culture that allowed her to think it was normal. We're not just punishing a person. We're rebuilding a standard. One mistake on her part doesn't excuse the silence around her." The room was quiet. Preston continued. "From now on, I want every single first-class crew member trained personally, not just on procedures, but on perception. I want quarterly reviews, anonymous feedback from passengers, and a new reporting system for bias. This isn't a press strategy, it's permanent." One of the executives shifted in his seat. "That will require changes to our structure, staffing, and budget." Preston's eyes didn't blink. "Then change it." Back at school, Elliot stepped off the bus and walked toward the entrance, his hoodie pulled up, trying to avoid attention. But as he passed through the hallway, heads turned. Some kids whispered. Others just stared. One student stepped in front of him near his locker and said, "Hey, I saw what happened. Online. That was crazy." Elliot paused. "Yeah. I mean, you didn't even do anything and she—" The boy shook his head. "Anyway, just wanted to say, you didn't deserve that." Elliot didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "Thanks." He opened his locker, and as he placed his bag inside, he felt the folded note Brenda had given him. He pulled it out, glanced around, then opened it. "Remember, you're not here to be liked. You're here because you earned it. Keep your head up. B." He folded the note again, tucked it into his pocket, and smiled to himself, because for the first time since that flight, he realized something. He wasn't just the boy who got slapped. He was the one who made sure it would never happen again. The day passed slowly at school, each hour dragging like a heavy curtain between Elliot and the moment he could return home. The hallways buzzed with conversations, but wherever he walked, the noise seemed to dim around him. Eyes followed him, not in ridicule but in quiet curiosity. It wasn't the kind of attention that came with fame. It was the kind that followed someone who had been on the edge of something bigger than anyone wanted to talk about out loud. At lunch, he sat at his usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria. His friends, Ben, Claire, and Theo, joined him like they always did, but their usual joking and banter were absent. They picked at their food, stealing glances at him, unsure if they should ask, unsure if they should act like everything was normal. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "It's all over the news, you know." Elliot looked up. "I figured. They're showing the video, the part where she slapped you," Ben added. "And the part where your dad walked up to her like some kind of boss. That was wild." Theo leaned in. "Is it true that she got fired?" Elliot stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She got removed from the flight. She's suspended. The rest is still being decided." His voice was calm, even, but there was a maturity behind it now that hadn't been there before. A weight. He hadn't planned on becoming a symbol of anything. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but now that the spotlight had found him, he couldn't avoid it. "You okay?" Claire asked softly. Elliot nodded, but his eyes stayed down. "I will be." Back at headquarters, Preston stood in a glass-walled meeting room overlooking the city, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. Around him, members of the airline's senior leadership team sat in silence as the legal team finished their briefing. "The press response has been controlled," one executive said. "We've directed media outlets to our formal statement and made it clear that the incident is under review. Public reaction is heavily in your favor." "I'm not concerned about public reaction," Preston replied, his tone sharp. The room fell quiet again. "I'm concerned that something like this was able to happen under our name. I'm concerned that no one in that moment, not one employee, not one witness, stepped in before it became a headline. We don't fix that with statements. We fix that with structure." The HR director cleared her throat. "We've drafted a policy overhaul. It includes extended training, behavior audits, and crew mentorship. We're also creating a direct reporting line that bypasses mid-level management and sends discrimination complaints straight to the executive board." Preston nodded once. "Approve it and name it after him." Everyone turned toward him. "Name it after my son," Preston said again. "Let every crew member see it every time they open a training manual. Let them remember what it cost." No one argued. Meanwhile, Cheryl sat at her small kitchen table, dressed in a plain gray sweater, her hair tied back loosely. She had stayed home all day, curtains drawn, television off, phone flipped face down. The silence in her apartment was deafening. The only sound came from the steady ticking of a clock on the wall. She opened her laptop again. The apology email still sat in the drafts folder. She hadn't added to it, hadn't deleted it. She just stared at it, unsure of whether she had the right to say anything at all. But eventually she clicked send. She didn't send it to Preston, she didn't send it to Brenda, she sent it to Elliot. The subject line was simple. "From the woman who judged you." The body of the email was short. "You don't know me and I didn't know you. But I made a choice about who you were without asking. I took your peace and turned it into pain. I can't take that moment back, but I can promise it's the last time I ever act from a place of pride. I'm sorry." She pressed send and sat back, unsure if it would even be read. But the moment it left her screen, something inside her shifted. Not relief, not closure, just movement. For the first time, she stopped feeling stuck. That evening, as the sun dipped low and gold light poured through Elliot's bedroom window, he sat at his desk finishing homework. His phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw the email notification. He read the name. For a second, his stomach twisted. He opened it. He read every word slowly, twice. Then he closed the email, put the phone down, and looked out the window. He didn't respond. He didn't delete it either. Some things didn't need answers. Some things only needed to be heard. And Cheryl, sitting in her quiet apartment, finally heard herself for the first time. It wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. 2 weeks passed. The buzz of headlines quieted, but the story didn't fade. It had become something else now, not a trending topic, not just a controversy. It had settled into the bones of the company, into the walls of Preston's airline, into training sessions, policy binders, and whispered conversations among crew members on flights around the country. Inside company buildings, the name Elliott Carter Policy Reform was now printed clearly at the top of every internal memo relating to conduct, equality, and passenger respect. Preston hadn't made the choice for branding or drama. He made it because he wanted every employee to be reminded of what silence had allowed and what accountability now required. The reform wasn't performative. It was practical. Crew members were now required to complete updated training that focused on behavioral psychology, implicit bias, and emotional intelligence. But there were no PowerPoint slides, no cookie-cutter quizzes. Preston had personally reviewed the program and insisted it include real case studies, including Elliot's story, discussed openly, even uncomfortably, in training rooms filled with people who could no longer say, "I didn't know." He watched the first session from behind a tinted observation window. The facilitator read the scenario aloud, detailing how a teenage passenger, properly ticketed, had been publicly accused, humiliated, and physically struck. He listened as flight attendants squirmed in their seats, their faces stiff. A few shifted in their chairs. One spoke up. "I would have stepped in." The facilitator nodded but replied evenly, "And why didn't anyone else?" No one had an answer. Preston stepped away before the session ended. He didn't need to hear them discuss. What mattered was that they were being forced to confront it, and in that discomfort, something new could grow. Back at school, Elliot began to settle back into a routine. The initial shock around what had happened had faded. He no longer walked through the hallways with everyone staring. Most of the students had stopped whispering when he passed. But the experience had changed how he moved in the world. Not with fear, but with awareness. He noticed things now, like when a security guard at a convenience store followed another kid around for no reason, or when a classmate's father made a sly comment about certain kids acting too entitled. The words didn't sting the same way anymore. They didn't surprise him. They confirmed something he now knew was always there, just quieter, just hidden. But with that awareness came something else too: power. At lunch, a younger student, a 7th grader named Marcus, approached him nervously. "Hey, I saw what happened on the news. Just wanted to say it was wrong." Elliot smiled, small and kind. "Thanks." The kid paused. "People used to tell me I didn't look like I should be in the honors class. I get it." Elliot nodded. "Then don't let them make you forget you earned it." The boy smiled and walked away. Elliot didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like someone who had been thrown into a storm, stayed standing, and learned to walk through the rain without ducking his head. That evening, Preston came home early. Not from the office, but from a board meeting where he had been offered an award he declined. The organizers had called it a Leadership in Crisis Award. But Preston saw it as something else. "They want to congratulate me for fixing something I allowed to exist," he told Brenda as they sat in the den. "I'm not taking credit for cleaning up my own house." Brenda stirred her tea, her voice calm. "You didn't build the problem, Preston." "I didn't break it," he said. "But I didn't see it soon enough either." She placed a hand on his. "You saw it when it mattered." Upstairs, Elliot was scrolling through his email when he found something new. An invitation from the school principal. Subject: Equity and Voice Student Forum Panel Invitation. The body read, "Elliot, we are organizing a student-led forum on equality, representation, and student voice. Your presence on the panel would bring real meaning to the conversation. We hope you'll consider it." He stared at it for a while, then typed a simple response. "Yes, I'll be there." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair. For a moment he looked toward the window where the moonlight spilled onto the floor. He thought about everything that had happened. The pain, the silence, the slap, the cameras, the eyes that watched and the voices that stayed quiet. And the moment when, without warning, the world stopped looking past him and started seeing him clearly. Not because he shouted, not because he forced them, but because he stayed standing when it would have been easier to sit down and disappear. He closed his laptop. The world wasn't fixed, but it was finally listening. It was a bright Saturday morning when Elliot and Preston found themselves seated side by side in a modest, sunlit auditorium inside the local community center. The walls weren't covered with corporate banners or press logos, just school posters, student art, and a small cloth sign above the stage that read, "Voices that Matter." It wasn't a press event, and there were no flashing cameras. But the room was packed. Students, teachers, parents, even a few school district leaders had shown up, unsure of what to expect, but knowing they needed to be there. Elliot had been quiet the whole ride over. Preston hadn't pressured him. He had simply offered support, driving his son there, sitting in the front row, letting him lead. When Elliot's name was called, he stood and walked up to the stage, his hands steady but his heartbeat fast. He wasn't used to microphones, wasn't used to being the one in front of a room full of eyes. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't here to perform. He was here to tell the truth. He sat on the panel between two other students, one a girl who had experienced harassment in class, the other a boy who had been unfairly disciplined for something he hadn't done. The moderator, a soft-spoken teacher named Mr. Hadley, asked each of them to share one moment where they felt powerless. When it was Elliot's turn, he looked at the microphone, then at the audience, and then he looked down for a second, collecting himself. "I was sitting in a seat that my father paid for," he said, his voice clear. "I showed my ticket, I followed every rule, but I still got pulled out, I still got hit." The room went still. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak calmly. She didn't even try to figure out if I was in the wrong. She just looked at me and decided I didn't belong. He paused, letting the words sink in. "I didn't say anything loud. I didn't yell. I didn't fight. But something happened that day. She made a decision about me based on nothing but how I looked. And for a while I believed her. I believed that maybe I shouldn't have been there." Some of the adults shifted in their seats. Brenda, seated a few rows behind Preston, wiped a quiet tear from her cheek. "But then something else happened," Elliot continued. "People saw it. Not just what she did, but how they stayed silent. And after that, people started listening. And I realized, being seen isn't enough. You have to be respected." A round of soft applause began to grow, not forced, not polite, genuine. "And I'm not just talking about what happened to me," Elliot said, his voice rising just slightly. "I'm talking about every kid in this room who's been told they're too loud, or not polished enough, or don't look like they belong. I'm talking about all the quiet stuff, the stuff that doesn't get filmed but happens every single day." He looked around the room, locking eyes with students in the crowd. "If we don't talk about it, it keeps happening. If we don't tell the truth, it just hides better. So I'm telling mine. because silence isn't strength. When he sat back down, there was no standing ovation, but that made it more real. No one was clapping because he was Preston Carter's son. They clapped because his story didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to all of them. After the panel, a line quietly formed near the stage. Not for autographs, for conversations. One girl, barely 13, walked up and said, "My teacher tells me I talk too much, but my brother talks just as much and she calls him confident." I didn't know how to explain why it felt unfair, until now. Elliot nodded and told her, "Don't change. Let them catch up." Nearby, Preston stood with a small group of district officials. One of them, a woman from the equity office, said carefully, "Your son? He's got presence." Preston smiled, pride in his eyes. He's got clarity. The presence came after. Back at home that evening, Elliot placed the school badge from the forum on his desk. He didn't pin it to the wall. He didn't post about it online. He just kept it there, quietly, like a reminder. Brenda walked in with a cup of cocoa and set it beside him. "I heard what you said today." He looked up, surprised. "I didn't see you." "You were focused," she smiled. "Like your father. You made people feel seen." Elliot leaned back in his chair. "Do you think she meant it, the apology?" Brenda paused. "I think she meant it in the moment. What she does next will decide if it meant anything beyond that." Elliot didn't answer. He looked down at his desk. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything. But he would never forget the moment someone decided his worth based on their own fear. And now, with every quiet step he took, he was building something bigger than revenge. He was building a path, so that the next kid who sat in seat 1A didn't have to carry the weight of proving they belonged. Because they already did. A month had passed. Spring had begun to stretch across the city, trees blooming along sidewalks, soft sunlight spilling onto front porches and rooftops, and the air no longer heavy with winter silence. But for the Carter family, the season brought more than a shift in weather. It brought clarity. Preston stood on the balcony of his office tower, the skyline spread wide before him. The city pulsed below, flashing signs, honking taxis, lives unfolding. But his thoughts were somewhere else. His phone buzzed with messages, but he ignored it. Instead, he scrolled to a photo on his screen, a simple picture of Elliot, standing at the student forum with a microphone in his hand, head held high. He'd looked at it a dozen times since that day, not for pride, not to relive a moment, but because it reminded him why leadership meant more than running a company. It meant owning the air people breathed when they stepped into a space you built, and making sure that air was clean, fair, safe, and open to all. A soft knock came from the door. His assistant stepped in. "The final report from Flight 227 is ready for your signature." He nodded, took the file, and opened it. At the top of the document were two bold words, "Closed case." Underneath was the summary of disciplinary actions, policy changes, retraining programs, and the full timeline of events. Everything had been handled, officially, legally, publicly. But one line at the end, added by someone in the Internal Affairs Department, stood out. "Because one boy didn't yell back, thousands more will be treated right." Preston didn't smile. He just signed his name. Then he closed the file and walked to the elevator, phone in hand. Across town, Elliot sat in his room, his headphones off, the world outside his window soft with the orange glow of evening. On his desk sat something new, a letter in a plain white envelope. No logo, no return address, just his name. He'd received it 2 days earlier but hadn't opened it. Not until now. He unfolded the paper slowly. "Elliot, I've watched the videos. I've read the articles. But none of them captured how calm you were, how strong. I want you to know, I'm not who I thought I was. I used to believe I was fair, that I followed the rules. But I only saw what I wanted to. I've lost the job I worked for. But maybe that's fair, because you lost something that day too. Your peace, your dignity, your trust. I hope you get all of it back." Cheryl Dawson. Elliot read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel bitterness. Just quiet, and something close to understanding. He stood and walked downstairs. Brenda was in the kitchen setting down plates for dinner. "Dad's home?" he asked. "Should be any minute now." Elliot walked to the window, watching the gate swing open as Preston's car rolled up the driveway. The door opened, and Preston stepped out, jacket over one shoulder, his posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been in weeks. When they sat down to eat, no one talked about the flight. No one talked about the media. They talked about school projects, the game on Saturday, Brenda's new cookbook. Normal things. The kind of normal that had felt far away for a while. But as the meal wound down, Preston looked at Elliot and said quietly, "They've added your name to the new crew handbook. It's part of the first section, what respect means on every flight." Elliot paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "You didn't have to do that." "I didn't," Preston said. "The board did. They said it reminded them that rules aren't just words. They're actions. Yours reminded them what silence can cost." Elliot looked down for a second. Then he said softly, "I still think about the moment she slapped me." Preston didn't flinch. "You always will." Elliot nodded. "But it doesn't hurt the same way anymore." Outside, the sky faded from gold to dark blue. Brenda gathered dishes, humming to herself. Preston leaned back in his chair. Elliot stood, walking to the living room, and opened his backpack to pull out the Forum badge. He didn't wear it. He didn't display it. But he kept it close. Because it meant something now. It meant that the boy in seat 1A, the one who was told he didn't belong, had changed something. Not by fighting fire with fire. Not by yelling louder than anyone else. But by holding still. By letting the world watch. By refusing to disappear. And because he did, people in uniforms now thought twice. Passengers remembered their silence. And an airline rewrote the very way it trained its crew. All because a boy stayed in his seat and taught the world to see him. If this story touched you, make sure to give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Your support means everything.